My wife was motionless in the room when I entered. The clock on the wall said 3:17 in the morning. The hands seemed to hammer the silence, but they couldn't drown out the noise of my own thoughts. There was something wrong there. Very wrong. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, as if that threadbare carpet hid some secret she didn't want me to discover. But I already knew. I knew from the moment I saw the lights of a car disappearing around the corner and realized that she hadn't gone out to get water or to check on any strange noises. I knew because, in my head, the pieces started to fall into place in a cruel way. The strange scent in the house days before. The messages she typed too quickly and then deleted. The long baths. The shortest hugs. Everything screamed a truth that I didn't want to accept, but that at that moment exploded in front of me. I leaned against the door and took a step towards it. The floor creaked beneath my feet, but she didn't move. He didn't lift his head, he didn't take a deeper breath, he didn't look for words to fill the suffocating space between us. It was then that I spoke, with a trembling voice, but carrying a weight that I didn't even know I had. Who was he? She didn't respond. He just pressed his hands against his legs, as if he were holding something about to shatter. Who was him? The repetition made her finally look at me, and I saw in her eyes everything I needed to see. Blame. Fear. Shame. But also something more. Something that burned me inside. Relief. It was as if she was ready to let go of that weight. As if she wanted to be caught. I could feel it in the air, and it destroyed me even more. I can explain, she said, and the sentence sounded so predictable that it hurt more than if she had remained silent. I laughed. A dry, bitter laugh that echoed through the empty house. Explain. Will you explain why he was here? Why did he come out of my garage? Or why didn't you even try to hide it? She stood up finally, but her legs were shaking. I didn't want you to find out like this, she began, but I cut her off. How then? Did you want me to come and see you two in bed? Or maybe I wish he was still here, to face me in my own home. Is this what you wanted? She shook her head, tears falling, but I couldn't stop. Because at that moment everything felt like a bad movie playing in my mind. The happy moments. The plans. The promises. Every kiss, every hug, every early morning we spent together felt like a lie now. I wanted to scream, I wanted to break something, but instead I kept looking at her, hoping she would say something that would erase what I already knew. But nothing would erase that. It was just once, she whispered, and I laughed again. Of course it was just once. It always is. But I knew better. I knew why no one looks at the ground like that for something that only happened once. No one freezes when they see their husband arrive because they made a small mistake. That had roots. Deep. And the more I thought, the more I felt the bitter taste of everything I had experienced with her. How long? I asked, because I needed to hear it from her. I needed to see how she would lie or try to minimize it. But she didn't try. She just closed her eyes and let the silence answer for her. And that silence broke me. I walked to the window, as if I needed to see the tire tracks he left in the driveway to believe it. To accept that the woman I loved had let another man walk through our door. To accept that I had slept next to her every night while she dreamed about him. I heard her footsteps approaching, but I didn't turn around. I'm sorry, she said, and for a moment I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe that she really felt it, that it was a mistake, that it could be fixed. But then I remembered the nights I felt alone while she was by my side. I remembered the apologies, the cold touches, the kisses that seemed more like a habit than a desire. I remembered everything, and I believed that maybe she was sorry, but not for the reason I wanted. He left you, didn't he? I asked, finally looking at her. I saw the surprise in her eyes, as if that was the last thing I expected to hear. But I knew. I knew why no one acts like she was acting if there's still something. She was alone. Abandoned. And now he was crawling back to the place he destroyed. What happened? Did he get tired? Used you and threw you away? Or did he also have someone else and decided to go back to her? She opened her mouth to respond, but I didn't let her. Because at that moment, her answer no longer mattered. Nothing else mattered other than the fact that I would never look at her the same way again. I would never look at us the same way again. But, as the clock continued to tick down the minutes in that suffocating dawn, something inside me began to change. I realized that betrayal was not the end. At least, not for me. Because I knew there was more. I knew that night was just the beginning of something much bigger. Something that I still couldn't see, but that was already beginning to form in the shadows of that room. And as she begged me to talk, to listen, to understand, I knew I wouldn't stop until I discovered every bit of the truth. Because as much as it all destroyed me, I needed to know. I needed to understand. And, above all, I needed to make sure that this story wasn't over yet. Not for me. Not like that. Welcome to the channel where we reveal the devastating consequences of betrayal. Here, we do not support and never romanticize infidelities. All stories presented are fictional, created to show how betrayal can destroy lives, relationships and trust. Get ready to dive into an intense and shocking narrative, full of emotions and twists. Sit back, take a deep breath and be ready for a story that will move you. Happy listening. Michael glanced at the clock on the wall as the aroma of fresh coffee wafted through the kitchen. It was an ordinary morning, or at least it should have been. The sun streamed through the white curtains, illuminating the spotless marble counter that Sarah took such pride in keeping clean. He sat at the table, absent-mindedly leafing through a newspaper that no longer seemed interesting. His mind was elsewhere, lost in memories of how simpler everything seemed a few years ago. At the time he and Sarah met, everything seemed to fit perfectly. She was spontaneous, full of energy, and had that smile that made any place seem lighter. He was practical, centered and liked the stability he had found with her. But lately, there was something different. Something he couldn't name, but felt. Sarah entered the kitchen holding a cup and a cell phone in her other hand. Her brown hair was tied up in a loose bun, and her tired eyes betrayed a bad night's sleep. Michael watched her for a moment before asking if she was okay. She smiled, but it was a quick, almost rehearsed smile, before saying that she had just woken up too early. Michael nodded but wasn't convinced. He knew Sarah well enough to know when something was bothering her, but he also knew that forcing a conversation about it wouldn't get anywhere. So he just kept stirring his coffee as he felt that silent tension spread throughout the room. They had been married for 10 years. 10 years of ups and downs, of achievements and disappointments, but, above all, of companionship. Michael has always been proud of the marriage they built. He liked how safe he felt next to her, as if they had created a world of their own. But lately, he felt like he was outside this world, like Sarah had started to build another space in which he had no place. The feeling bothered him, but he couldn't find a concrete reason for it. Sarah, on the other hand, was lost in thought as she looked at her phone. Her hands shook slightly as she slid her finger across the screen, but she quickly put the device aside when she noticed Michael watching her. She smiled again, but her eyes were empty, and Michael noticed. He tried to ignore the pang of discomfort growing inside him. After all, they were just going through a rough patch, like all couples, right? He convinced himself of this as he finished his coffee and grabbed his car keys. Outside, the light wind shook the trees in the garden. Michael always liked taking care of that space. It was the kind of thing that made him feel in control, something that seemed increasingly rare these days. He got into the car and started it, but the thought of Sarah kept ringing in his head. She had been distracted for weeks, and no matter how much he tried to ignore it, the feeling that something was wrong wouldn't leave him alone. Sarah stayed in the kitchen, looking out the window as Michael left. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes for a moment. She felt guilty for hiding so many things from him, but at the same time, she didn't know how to stop. She didn't know how to explain what she felt or what had brought her to that point. She loved Michael, or at least wanted to believe she still did. He was a good man, dedicated and trustworthy. It always was. And maybe that was the problem. She wanted to feel more. I needed to feel more. But instead, she felt an emptiness that grew more and more, even when he was by her side. Throughout the day, Michael found himself distracted at work. He couldn't get Sarah out of his mind. He mentally replayed the last few months, trying to find a moment when things started to change, but everything seemed too subtle. It was as if the transformation had happened slowly, almost imperceptibly, until it became impossible to ignore. He wondered if he should talk to her that night, but something stopped him. Fear. Fear of discovering that his suspicions were founded. When he returned home, he found Sarah sitting on the sofa, looking at the television, but looking lost. He sat next to her, trying to create some kind of connection, but she seemed distant. Michael held her hand, and for a moment, she squeezed back. But then she let go slowly, as if she didn't want him to notice. He noticed. Everything felt wrong. The small gestures, the prolonged silences, the automatic responses. Michael wanted to believe it was just stress, that Sarah was just tired or going through something that would soon be resolved. But deep down, he knew it wasn't that simple. As she went up to her room, he stood in the living room, feeling more and more lost. He wondered if he was imagining things, if he was creating paranoia because of the exhausting routine. But the doubts were still there, like an uncomfortable echo that wouldn't go away. He looked at his cell phone on the table and felt the urge to check it. He knew he shouldn't, that it was wrong to invade her privacy, but the impulse was too strong. He picked up the device and unlocked the screen, but stopped before opening anything. The fear of what he might find was greater than his curiosity. He put his cell phone back in its place and went up to his room. Sarah was already in bed, but she wasn't sleeping. Michael lay down next to her, trying to get closer, but he felt her body move away almost imperceptibly. He closed his eyes, trying to ignore the tightness in his chest. Tomorrow would be better, he told himself. Tomorrow everything would be fine. But that night, as silence took over the house, they both knew, in places they didn't want to admit, that something had already changed. Something that perhaps could no longer be fixed. Michael had felt something was wrong for weeks, but he couldn't put his finger on exactly what it was. He would wake up in the middle of the night and look at Sarah sleeping next to him, breathing calmly, as if nothing was out of place, but the void between them seemed to grow every day. He tried to find logical explanations. Maybe it was work that put pressure on her, maybe it was the accumulated responsibilities around the house or, who knows, the inevitable wear and tear after so many years together. But there was something in his chest that screamed something else, a nagging voice that he tried to silence. However, that voice only got louder, especially when Sarah picked up her cell phone and turned her back to it, as if to hide what she was doing. The days piled up and Michael began to notice patterns. Messages received late at night that she ignored in front of him, but responded to when she was alone in the kitchen. Calls that ended too quickly as soon as he entered the room. The trips to the market that seemed to take longer than necessary and the excuses to go out for a walk when it was already dark. He tried not to create stories in his head. He told himself he was being paranoid, but at the same time, he couldn't ignore the feeling that there was a growing distance between the two, something that seemed impossible to close. One night, while Sarah was taking a shower, Michael heard her cell phone vibrate on the nightstand. He looked at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number, but what really caught his attention was the preview message, "I can't wait to see you again." His hands immediately sweated. He felt his stomach drop, but he didn't unlock his phone. He stood there, looking at that message as if it were a bomb about to explode, and then put the device in place before Sarah left the bathroom. When she appeared, wrapped in a towel and her hair damp, he tried to smile, but he felt his own face contract in a strange way. She asked if everything was okay, and he just replied that he was tired. That night, Michael couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in bed, feeling his body tense while Sarah slept peacefully beside him. The message wouldn't get out of his head, and he began to remember all the moments he ignored signs. The different perfumes, the changes in behavior, the less frequent touches, the way she always seemed to be somewhere else, even when she was there with him. He wondered if he was imagining everything or if, in fact, he was losing the woman he loved to someone he didn't even know. Over the next few days, Michael began to observe more closely. He didn't want to be the kind of man who spied on his wife, but the need to know the truth was overwhelming. He noticed how she smiled at her cell phone in a way that she no longer smiled at him, how she seemed more excited when leaving the house and always returned with a distant look, as if her mind was still somewhere else. Even the intimate moments between them had become mechanical, as if she were just fulfilling an obligation. Michael tried to convince himself that he was exaggerating, but reality seemed increasingly clear. It was then that, on a cold night, everything collapsed. Michael arrived home early from work, deciding to surprise Sarah with a special dinner. He stopped by the market, bought flowers, and chose a wine he knew she liked. He wanted to rekindle something between them, show that he still cared, that he was still there. But as he parked in the garage, he noticed something strange. The lights in the house were off, except for the living room, which displayed a soft light. When he entered, the silence seemed heavier than ever. He called for Sarah, but there was no response. It was then that he heard the sound of hurried footsteps and saw a shadow moving across the room. Michael moved forward quickly, and what he saw made his heart stop. A man, wearing dark clothes, was walking out the back door. Michael could barely process the scene. He stood there, watching the man disappear into the night, while Sarah came down the stairs, her eyes wide and her face pale. She stopped when she saw him and froze on the top step. Michael tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. All he could do was stare at her, hoping she would say something that would make the situation less horrible, less irreversible. Sarah opened her mouth, but closed it again. Her eyes were full of tears, and she looked like she was about to break down. Michael finally found his voice and asked who the man was who had just left. She tried to deny it at first, said he was just a friend, but the words sounded empty, broken. Michael didn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. He kept pressing, asking why this man was in their house, why he left like that, why she looked so scared. Until finally Sarah started crying and said she was sorry. Michael felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. He looked at Sarah, waiting for her to deny what was implied by her tears, but she didn't. Instead, she kept apologizing, saying that she didn't want to hurt him, that she didn't plan for that to happen, but her words were like knives cutting through every piece of him. He pulled away, feeling his chest tighten, as if the air had disappeared. She tried to get closer, but he raised his hand, ordering her to stop. Michael couldn't think, couldn't breathe properly. His head spun as images of happy moments played like a distorted movie. He wanted to scream, he wanted to break something, but at the same time, he felt a paralyzing emptiness. Sarah was still there, crying, trying to explain, but he couldn't hear anything else. Everything seemed distant, as if he were trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He finally found the strength to move. He took the keys and walked out the door without looking back, leaving Sarah alone in the room. As he walked down the dark street, with a heavy heart, he knew that night had changed everything. Nothing would be the same again. But what he still didn't know was that betrayal was just the tip of the iceberg. And the real secret was yet to be revealed. Michael spent the night awake, sitting in the car, parked on a random street. The bottle of whiskey he bought on the way was almost empty on the passenger seat. The silence around him seemed to mock the noise in his head. The images of Sarah crying, apologizing, and trying to justify what was unjustifiable kept spinning like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He wanted to hate her, but more than that, he wanted to understand. I needed to know why. I needed answers that might not even exist. As the sun began to rise over the horizon, he started the engine and headed home, even though he didn't know what he expected to find. As he opened the door, he smelled fresh coffee. Sarah was in the kitchen, with her back turned, stirring a spoon in her cup. He watched her for a moment, trying to decipher how she managed to act so normally after the night before. When she turned around and saw him standing there, her eyes filled with tears again, but she didn't say anything. Michael crossed the room, dropped his keys on the counter and finally broke the silence. He asked if she had anything else to tell him, something he didn't already know. Sarah was silent, looking at the floor. He approached and asked her to speak, to say everything, because he could no longer bear that feeling of being lost. She looked up and said there was something he needed to know, but he didn't know how to start. Michael insisted, saying that she should be direct, because he had already imagined every possible scenario and none of them were good. Sarah took a deep breath, set the cup in the sink, and, in a shaky voice, said that the man he saw leaving the house the night before wasn't just someone she was having an affair with. He was someone who was in her life long before she met Michael. Michael frowned, trying to understand what she meant, but she continued, saying that the man was someone who had never really left her life, even when they got married. Michael took a step back, as if he needed space to process her words. He asked if she was saying that she had been in a relationship with that man longer than she had been married. Sarah confirmed, but before he could react, she added that it wasn't just a relationship. He was the father of the son she had before she met Michael. Michael froze. He felt the ground crumble beneath his feet. Son. He never knew of any children. Sarah has always said that she never wanted to have children and that she didn't feel ready to be a mother. How could she hide something so big? He asked where this child was, but Sarah shook her head and said the child was never born. She said that, before meeting Michael, she had a troubled relationship with the man he saw that night. They separated shortly after she discovered she was pregnant, and he insisted that she terminate the pregnancy. She, under pressure and without support, did what he asked. But the regret never went away. She said that when Michael came into her life, she saw in him the stability and affection that she never had in her previous relationship. But even so, he was unable to free himself from the weight of that decision. Michael was speechless. He tried to piece together that revelation, but each new piece of information felt heavier than the last. He asked if she had returned to her lover because she still loved him, and Sarah quickly shook her head no. She said she never wanted to be with him again, but that he came back to her months ago, saying he also had regrets and wanted to talk. At first she resisted, but then she gave in. He said he just wanted to close that chapter, try to find peace to move forward. But instead, she ended up trapped in a cycle that brought all her buried feelings and guilt to the surface. Michael ran his hand over his face, feeling cold sweat run down the back of his neck. He asked if she slept with the man, and Sarah admitted that she had. She said it was a moment of weakness, something she immediately regretted. But Michael couldn't hear that without feeling his blood boil. He knocked on the table and asked her if she thought an apology would solve everything. He asked her if she really believed she could hide all this from him and continue living as if nothing had happened. Sarah started crying again, saying she knew she was wrong, but she didn't know how to get out of the situation. She said she tried to walk away, but the man kept reappearing, bringing back memories of the past and the pain of everything they had lost. Michael interrupted her, saying that the problem wasn't just the past. It was the present. It was the fact that she allowed that man to come into their home, into their lives, and destroy everything they had built together. He said the worst of it wasn't the physical betrayal, but the fact that she had lied for so long, that she had kept secrets he could never imagine. Sarah tried to get closer, but Michael backed away. He said he needed time to think, to understand if there was something there that could still be saved. But deep down, he already knew the answer. Before leaving the house, Michael looked at Sarah one last time. She looked broken, but he couldn't feel sorry. All I could feel was the pain of having been lied to and used for years without ever realizing it. When he closed the door behind him, he felt like this was the last time he would step into that house as her husband. But what he still didn't know was that that story was far from over. There were more secrets hidden, and the full truth was about to be revealed in an even more devastating way. Michael drove for hours without a clear destination. His hands were gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. The echo of Sarah's words still played in his mind, but he needed space, he needed to move away to process everything. When he finally parked, he realized he was in front of a small motel. He went in, took a key and locked himself in the stuffy room. He sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the floor, trying to piece together what was left of his life. He couldn't help but imagine Sarah in that man's arms. Every detail appeared in his mind as if he had been there to watch. The whispers, the touches, the desire. All of that was unbearable. He threw his car keys at the wall and heard the metallic clang break the silence, but it didn't ease the pain. The betrayal was hard enough to accept, but what really destroyed him was the weight of the secret she had hidden for years. A son. An abortion. An entire past she erased and never shared. How could he trust her again? Hours later, when tiredness finally won, he fell asleep, but sleep did not bring peace. He dreamed of Sarah crying, begging for forgiveness, while he tried to reach her, but something always stopped him. He woke up sweating, with his heart racing. He picked up his cell phone and saw several missed calls from her, but he didn't have the courage to return them. Instead, he decided to return home. He needed to confront her once again. When he arrived, he found Sarah sitting on the couch, her eyes red and swollen. She stood up as soon as she saw him enter, but he raised his hand to stop her from speaking. He needed to maintain control. He said he wanted to hear the whole truth, without half words or omissions. Sarah hesitated, but eventually agreed. He said he needed to tell everything, even if it would completely destroy any hope that remained between them. She began by saying that, after the abortion, the man promised to change, said he loved her and that they could start over. She believed him, but the reality was different. He manipulated her, made her feel guilty about what happened, and kept her emotionally trapped. When she finally found the courage to end everything, she met Michael. He was her salvation. It was the man who made her feel safe for the first time in years. But the past never left her alone. Michael listened in silence, but something about the way Sarah spoke began to bother him. There was more there. He could feel it. He pressed to know what she was still hiding, but Sarah looked away, trying to avoid the question. Until finally, she gave in. She said the man came back to her months ago, but not just to relive the past. He was desperate, in debt and threatened to expose everything about the abortion and their relationship if she didn't help him financially. At first, Sarah resisted, but he started following her, showing up at work and sending her messages, until she relented. Michael was silent for a moment before asking how much she had given him. Sarah lowered her head and replied that she took money from their savings. Michael exploded. He asked how she could cross so many boundaries, lie, cheat and still compromise the financial security they had built together. Sarah was crying, saying it was a mistake, that she didn't know how to handle the situation and that all she wanted was to protect their marriage. Michael laughed bitterly, asking if that felt like protection for her. He asked her if she thought she could maintain a marriage built on lies and blackmail. Sarah tried to get closer, but he moved away. He said she was no longer the woman he knew. She was no longer the woman he chose to share his life with. The silence stretched for long minutes. Then Sarah plucked up the courage to say there was more. She explained that the night before, when Michael caught the man leaving the house, it wasn't because she invited him. He showed up unexpectedly, demanding more money. When she refused, he threatened to tell Michael and their friends everything. She panicked, tried to make him leave, but he refused until he heard the sound of the car in the garage. Michael didn't know if he believed her. He was so emotionally exhausted that he could barely think. But one thing was certain, that situation had gone beyond the limit. He took out his cell phone and threatened to call the police. Sarah begged him not to do that, saying that the man had evidence against her, messages and bank transactions that could ruin everything. Michael hung up his cell phone and stood still, looking at her. He felt a mixture of anger, pity, and disgust. He asked what she expected him to do. Sarah said she just wanted another chance, that she would do anything to prove she still loved him, but Michael shook his head. He said he didn't know if he could look at her again without seeing the lies, the betrayals, and the secrets. He took the keys and left the house. I needed air, I needed to think. He walked aimlessly for minutes that seemed like hours, until he decided to do something he had avoided all that time. He called a close friend and told him everything. The friend was shocked, but offered support. I told him he didn't have to face this alone. When he returned home, he found Sarah in the same place, hugging her knees. He said they needed time apart to understand what they wanted. He said he still didn't know what he would do, but that she should seek help to deal with the past, because he couldn't continue carrying that weight alone. Sarah agreed, but begged him not to give up on them. Michael left again, without giving a definitive answer. The cool night air enveloped him as he thought about everything that had happened. I knew that wasn't the last conversation. I knew the worst was yet to come. But for the first time, he felt like he was beginning to take back control of his own life. Michael spent the night walking the streets, without direction and not knowing what he should do next. Sarah's words echoed in her mind, mixing with the distant noise of cars and the hurried footsteps of people going about their lives as if nothing was wrong in the world. He felt out of place, as if he had left his own body and was watching everything from the outside. He stopped in an empty square and sat on a bench, feeling the cold wind pass through his coat. He tried to organize his thoughts, but everything seemed jumbled, a tangle of doubts, anger and a pain he didn't know how to describe. The image of Sarah crying on the couch was still stuck in his head, and he wondered how someone he knew so well could have become a stranger before his eyes. He thought about the past, about the first years together, when everything seemed simple and natural. He remembered the trips, the long conversations in the early hours of the morning and how Sarah used to laugh at his jokes, even when they weren't funny. Thinking about it only made things worse, because it made it even harder to accept what she had done. He tried to find justifications, but everything sounded empty. She betrayed him, lied, hid secrets and brought that man into their lives. There was no excuse that could erase that. At the same time, he couldn't ignore what she said about being manipulated, about carrying regrets and fears she never shared. Part of him wanted to believe, wanted to accept that Sarah was just a victim trapped in her own weaknesses. But another part couldn't forgive the fact that she chose to lie and keep lying, even when she had countless chances to tell the truth. As the sun began to rise, Michael realized he needed to return home. He hadn't slept and his head hurt, but he knew there were still unresolved issues. He entered and found Sarah in the kitchen, wearing the same baggy sweatshirt as when he left. She was sitting at the table, an untouched cup of tea in front of her, and looked up as soon as he entered. There was a deep weariness on her face, as if the night had also been cruel. Michael didn't say anything at first, just pulled out a chair and sat across from her. Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but he raised his hand, asking for silence. He needed to be the one leading that conversation. He asked if she still had contact with the man, if there was anything else he didn't know. Sarah replied no, that she had blocked his number and just wanted to move on. Michael stared at her for a long moment, trying to figure out if she was telling the truth. This time he didn't see any hesitation in her eyes, but the problem was that he no longer knew if he could trust what he saw. He said he needed time, that he still didn't know if he could forgive her, but that he didn't want to make hasty decisions. Sarah nodded, as if she had already expected that answer, but her eyes filled with tears. She begged him not to give up on them, said she would do anything to prove that she could change, but Michael just hung his head, feeling too exhausted to continue that conversation. He went up to his room and closed the door, trying to get away from the weight of that situation, but he knew he was just postponing the inevitable. In the days that followed, Michael tried to keep his distance. He spent most of his time outside the house, at work or walking around aimlessly, while Sarah remained silent, respecting the space he requested. But the tension between them was suffocating. When they were in the same room, looks were avoided, and words were few. Michael knew he needed to decide what he would do, but he felt that any choice would lead to some kind of loss. One night, while looking through photos in an old album, he came across an image of Sarah holding his hand on the beach. It was the first summer after their wedding, and they seemed so carefree and happy. The memory hit him like a punch. He wondered if that had been real or just an illusion he built in his head. Suddenly he felt a surge of anger. He picked up the album and closed it tightly, throwing it back on the shelf. I couldn't live stuck with that anymore. I needed to face the truth, even if it hurt. The next morning, he called Sarah to talk. He said he was willing to listen again, but that he needed absolute honesty. She nodded and began to speak, this time without hesitation. She told her about the messages the man sent, about how he used their past to make her feel guilty and dependent. She said that the fear of losing Michael prevented her from telling the truth from the beginning, and that when she realized she was trapped in a cycle of lies, it was too late to turn back. Michael listened in silence, but deep down he felt that something was still wrong. He asked if she had told him everything or if she was still hiding something. Sarah hesitated, and her silence was enough for him to realize there was more. He pressured her until she admitted that the man had taken photos of her during their encounters and was threatening to release the images. She said he used this to blackmail her, forcing her to continue helping him financially. Michael stood up abruptly, feeling his blood boil. He asked her why she didn't tell him this before and why she let the situation get this far. Sarah said she was scared, that she thought she could handle everything on her own and protect her marriage. But Michael couldn't accept it. He asked how she could get so involved with someone who had already destroyed her life in the past and allow him to come back to ruin the present. Sarah cried as she tried to explain, saying that she felt guilty about the abortion, guilty about letting that man into their lives again, but that none of that justified what she did. Michael stood there, staring at her, trying to decide if those words were enough to convince him that she deserved another chance. Part of him wanted to believe that it was still possible to rebuild what they had, but another part knew that he would never be able to forget what had happened. He walked away, saying he needed to think. Sarah begged him not to leave her, but Michael walked out the door without looking back. I knew that story wasn't over yet, but at that moment, all I wanted was to escape the crushing weight I carried in my chest. I knew the end was approaching, but I also knew that before I got there, I would still have to face truths that I might not be ready to hear. Michael stood in front of the door for a long time before finally turning the key and entering the house. The smell of cold coffee and the muffled sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. Sarah was sitting on the couch, her hands clasped in her lap, her eyes fixed on the floor as if waiting for the final blow. He closed the door behind him, feeling the weight of that moment taking over the room. There was something different in the air, as if the decision he knew he needed to make had already been sealed before he even opened that door. She looked up slowly, her eyes tired and red from crying. He asked if he was ready to talk, but Michael remained silent. Her every word seemed to echo from an empty place, as if it no longer had the power to reach him. He approached slowly, sat in the armchair opposite her and crossed his arms. He said he needed answers and that, this time, he would not accept half-truths or excuses. Sarah nodded, wiping away the tears that insisted on falling, and began to speak. She said that, after everything that happened, she tried to get away from the man, but he kept reappearing, forcing her to choose between keeping the secret or risking losing everything. She said she was afraid to ask for help and that desperation made her make mistakes that she didn't know how to correct. Michael listened to everything without interrupting, but his gaze remained cold and distant. When she finished, he stood up and walked to the window, watching the dim lights that illuminated the deserted street. He said he understood her fear, but he couldn't accept the way she handled the situation. He asked her if she really believed that lying and cheating on him was the best way to protect their marriage. Sarah tried to argue, saying that she never wanted to hurt him and that everything she did was out of love, but Michael just shook his head. He asked her if she knew what love meant, because what he had seen in the last few months had nothing to do with love. She started crying again, begging for forgiveness, but Michael stood firm. He said that forgiving was not something he could offer at that moment. He said that, perhaps, one day, he could look at all that with less pain, but that, for now, the best thing for both of them was to follow different paths. Sarah panicked when she heard those words and tried to convince him to reconsider, but Michael had already made his decision. He said he couldn't continue living in that house, surrounded by memories that now seemed like lies. He went up to his room, grabbed some clothes and went downstairs without looking back. Sarah followed him to the door, holding his arm, asking him to stay and promising that she would do anything to fix what she had broken. Michael looked at her one last time, feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. He said that sometimes love wasn't enough and that some things just couldn't be fixed. When he left the house, he felt the fresh air fill his lungs and, for the first time in weeks, he could breathe without feeling the crushing weight of betrayal. But at the same time, he felt a deep emptiness, as if a part of him had been left behind. He knew that decision would bring pain, but he also knew it was the first step to rebuilding his life. Over the next few months, Michael focused on himself. She sought therapy, focused on her work and began to open up to new possibilities. She met new people, but remained somewhat afraid of getting involved again. The pain of being betrayed was still there, but little by little it began to turn into strength. He learned to set limits, to value his own peace and not to accept less than he deserved. Sarah, on the other hand, faced the consequences of her mistakes more harshly. The man who blackmailed her ended up being arrested for fraud, but the photos he had threatened to release were discovered by her coworkers. She lost her job and spent months trying to get back on her feet emotionally. Shame and regret consumed her, but despite this, she did not give up. She sought professional help, tried to forgive herself and began to rebuild her life alone. Michael moved on. On a work trip, he met someone who awakened feelings in him that he thought he would never feel again. It was a slow start, marked by distrust and caution, but over time, he allowed this new relationship to help him believe in love again. Unlike what he had with Sarah, this new story began with transparency and respect, and this made him realize how much he had grown with everything he had been through. Sarah also found a new direction. After months of therapy, she decided to start over in another city, far from everything that reminded her of the past. It took him time to forgive himself, but eventually he learned to accept his flaws and become a better person. She knew she would never get back what she lost, but she was determined not to repeat the same mistakes. Michael and Sarah never saw each other again. Their lives took different paths, and although the pain of what happened was never completely forgotten, they both found ways to move on. Michael learned that confidence is a precious commodity and that he would never again allow anyone to make him doubt himself. Sarah learned that lies can destroy even the strongest foundations and that the truth, no matter how difficult it may be, is always the best path. This story reminds us how betrayal can devastate lives, destroy relationships and leave scars that last forever. But it also shows us that the end of something does not mean the end of everything. There is always room for new beginnings, for learning and for growing from pain. Now I want to know your opinion. What did you think of this story? Do you think Michael made the right decision in leaving Sarah? Or do you believe he should have given you another chance? Leave your comment and share your vision about this intense plot. If you liked this story and want to hear more impactful stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any news. Remembering that the channel does not support any type of betrayal. Our goal is to show how wrong choices can have profound consequences and how important it is to value honesty and respect in any relationship. Until the next story.